Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Radnor Township School District, Tuesday, December 1st, 2020, virtual Finance Committee meeting. I'd like to thank everyone for being here and start off by welcoming our administrative liaison, Ms. Deco, and a representative from BBD, the district's financial auditors, Carl Hogan. And with that, Ms. Deco, do you have any administrative comments?
I do not.
Okay, then we'll get right underway. Ms. Dangle, do we have any public comment this evening?
No public comment. There is no public comment.
Okay, thank you. I was distracted there for a minute. Okay, then we're going to go right underway with item 3.1. Did the committee have an opportunity to look at the November 10th Finance Committee meeting minutes? And do we have any, are we good to go with those? A thumbs up? Okay, so we'll have those minutes marked as approved, and we will get right underway with our agenda, board agenda action items. As everyone is familiar with, every month we have a number of items that are on the agenda. We should expect to see the approval of the November 2020 financial reports and the December 2020 budget transfer. Now, we discussed that at last month's Finance Committee meeting, and then at the board meeting, Ms. Deco, we're going to talk about that from, maybe we'll talk about that in context with the audit of the slight change to those numbers. And then we should also expect to see on our agenda an addendum to the contract that we have with, oh, it doesn't say Lakeside here, but Ms. Deco, this is the Lakeside. In the agenda, if we can make sure that the agenda reflects that it's a contract with Lakeside, which is an outside contractor that we use for some of our special education services. And we are going to be, we talked about this as a board, we'll be bringing in the addition of a 0.4 in-school counseling services. And this is not going to come out of our budgeted funds, but it's going to be paid for with some COVID grant dollars that we received. Is that right, Ms. Deco?
That's correct. And I spoke with Jenny Lesage and George Regal today. They're actually looking to add some additional support because the grant dollars are much more than this $24,000 for the addendum to the contract with Lakeside. So I would expect that at some point, a little bit later, maybe in January or February, we'll see another addendum or an additional support services. These are mental health services that they're adding. So it's an exciting opportunity for our students.
Okay, so do we have any board members who have any questions about any of these items? Yes, Bradley, go ahead. Sure.
Bradley Jones, I just want to add too, it goes beyond just special education. This is really student services aspect that the support that Lakeside is giving us. So it's beyond just the special education umbrella.
Okay, Ms. Deco, if you could, when this shows up on the board agenda, because it's listed as a special education contract addendum, if it's clarified, Ken, thank you for clarifying that. Bradley, you had a question. Go ahead.
Thank you. We talked about this as an unbudgeted expense, and we're using these CARES and other dollars to pay for it because it's unbudgeted. Could those dollars have been used for something else, or are those particular grant monies directed only for this kind of expenditure? And to be clear, I'm not questioning. I think this investment in mental health services is very much money well spent.
So many of the COVID grant dollars are identified for very specific needs. We used a lot of grant dollars to pay for technology purchases, increased connectivity, and PPE and modifications to buildings, including plexiglass and signage. This grant was one that came about later, and this was something that Jenny and George had actually wanted to do previously. And we were planning to use some other COVID dollars for it, and perhaps a grant that we applied for last year and were not awarded. So when this grant came about, and it did have a component for mental health services, it just seemed to fit nicely with what Jenny and George had been wanting to do and actually weren't able to do because there weren't funds in the budget to do it.
So the grant we are receiving that we're using in this case does have some aspect in which some of that money can be or should be designated for mental health services.
It does. And it's also got other components as well, but we just felt that this was the greatest need that we were experiencing at this time.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions? So I have a couple of questions about this one. First of all, I think it's great. I think all of us on the board have heard or read, lots and lots of concerns around mental health challenges that, our students are experiencing in the face of COVID. Michelle, was this the limit of the grant? And maybe I'm asking it slightly differently from Bradley, but is this the limit of the grant? If we had need of more, is this something that we could go back and apply for more grant funds, or this is kind of it? And if we decide or believe that we need additional services, we would just, perhaps you would come to us as an unbudgeted item.
So this grant is actually for $105,000, or slightly over $105,000. So this is just a portion of what we're going to be spending. This grant actually runs 2 years. So it gives us the opportunity to not only provide those services in the 2021 year, but also in the 21-22 year. There is another grant opportunity that's going to be coming out. I expect to have some information regarding that grant within the next few days, maybe the next week or so. And we'll take a look at that grant as well. Whenever grant opportunities present themselves, if we think it's something that we can benefit from and possibly implement, then we apply for those grants. Sometimes we get them, sometimes we don't. This grant is not what they consider a competitive grant. The grant that I mentioned that the guidance hasn't come out yet, that is a competitive grant, and those are very targeted.
Okay. And then will this counseling service be directed to any particular school or just throughout the district?
Right now, it's going to be concentrated at the middle school and the high school level. There is the opportunity to perhaps expand that into the elementary levels. Jenny and George have expressed to me that they have seen their evaluations increase significantly during this COVID time. So again, this is really, as Ken said, a great opportunity for all of our students, special education as well as regular education students.
Okay. I mean, we don't frequently, we see approval of contracts and it's just straight up about the money. This one is an interesting conversation for us because it really does directly touch on the students. So Sarah, good for you to know this since you serve on curriculum. It'll be interesting at some point circling back to kind of the supports from a curriculum, educational, emotional, social emotional standpoint, that we're bringing this one through. We could have just as easily seen this on the curriculum agenda, but we typically do the contracts. All right, so great. So we'll expect to see those items on the December board agenda. And then let's move right into item 4.2, approval of the draft 2019-2020 audit report. And the administration is, recommending that we bring this report to the full board for approval at the December 15th regular business meeting. Although our agenda says Mike Mood from BBD will be here tonight to talk us through this. In fact, this is Carl Hogan or Hagan? It's Hogan.
Hogan, yep.
Yeah, Hogan. Your last name's not printed there, Carl, but I knew it was Hogan. We've done this a few times over. So welcome tonight. So we have, let's see, Nancy Monahan and Bradley Moore are new to our committee. Sarah Dunn, I think you've probably met before. She's served on finance for several years. And so why don't you walk us through kind of what you feel is the, some important highlights and pieces of information about the audit report. Somewhere in this conversation might be a good opportunity to just touch on that adjustment to the fund transfer that I referenced in the above agenda item. We talked about it at the board business meeting. There had been a change to the audit report just as we went into last week's board meeting. And so I'll let you take it away. I don't know if there's going to be screen sharing or if we're just going to.
Yep, I have the ability to screen share. Michelle, was talking about the COVID adjustment at the end?
We're talking about two different things, Carl. We're talking about the COVID adjustment at the end, and then the transfer that I talked to Dan and Mike about, because it was actually making the one page of our audit look as if we didn't have that big of a transfer for our QSEB bonds.
I got you.
Okay.
Yep, I know what you're talking about. All right, I'm gonna share my screen. All right, everybody see that?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so I'm going to kind of go over the highlights. I know Michelle has been keeping everybody abreast of where everything stands. Things have been moving a little bit here and there, as we just discussed. But at the end of the day, nothing overly material related to the overall audit report. I think the game plan is now to kind of go over the draft audit report, have the Finance Committee approve the draft audit report for approval at the December 15th meeting, correct?
Yes, Nick, Carl, before you get started, Michelle, is somebody coming next week or 2 weeks from now, or is Carl going to do this tonight? I mean, you're doing this tonight, but I'm not sure if anybody's coming to the full board meeting. Carl, just as a frame of reference, we have probably we do have 4 brand new board members. So I think this is their first full year of an audit report, and just a little bit of high level background of, the difference between the governmental activities and, why the report kind of looks the way it does, where we have business type activities in the governmental, and
Yep.
a little bit of context would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. And I'm assuming you guys are doing Zoom, and, being available for the 15th is not a problem at all. So actually, it's kind of worked out great because I had a meeting at 5:30. I hopped off that Zoom to this one. So
Great. Thank you.
So obviously, I'm just going to go over maybe even though it never, creates any conversation, but obviously the most important part of the audit report is the independent auditor's report, what you're paying for us to do, which is to basically give an opinion on your financial statements. This auditor's report is, it's almost 3 pages long. It keeps on getting longer and longer, I feel like, every, couple years. But basically what it's doing is outlining what your responsibilities are, our responsibilities. The second page kind of gives you a breakdown of what responsibility we're taking for the different sections of the audit report. But the smallest part is probably the most important part, and that's this here. Obviously being that, the numbers that are being presented in this audit report for the year ended June 30th, 2020 are fairly presented. So I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'm going to kind of focus really on the financial statement part. But for those people that are not advanced users of the financial statements and just want to kind of get an idea of what happened in 2019, 2020, I really encourage, especially the new board members, to read management's discussion and analysis. Radnor has always had a pretty robust management's discussion and analysis. I think a few years back, there was a lot of analysis of it, and a lot of things were added to it. A lot of different discussions based upon different input from different board members. And I think there's a lot of good, useful information here that will kind of explain to the board members, what happened during 2019, 2020. In particular, the financial highlights here, and if you scroll down a little bit, there's a fund analysis of your governmental funds. And I think this is really important. Just kind of gives you briefly, hey, here's where our fund balances are in our different funds. Here's the general fund analysis, the breakdown of the different commitments, the unassigned fund balance, and the change in each one of those amounts year over year. And then down below, I think is really important too, because I think once you get into the meat of the audit report and the way things are designed to be reported related to the expenditures, everything's kind of reported at a function level required by PDE, broken out by like instruction, special ed, and they might be not things that people recognize as natural classifications. But when you actually look here in the MD&A, management does a nice job of breaking down those revenues in kind of layman's terms and the year over year change in those revenues, and in particular the expenditures. So everybody.
Carl, I'm sorry. Could you just remind everybody what a PERTA tax is? It's up a little bit.
Yeah, the PERTA tax. This is just the annual appropriation that you receive from the state related to your utilities. That's received. So it's an annual appropriation. It seems to be decreasing on an annual basis, but for year over year, it basically remains the same.
Thank you.
And then down here, this is nice below, you have your salaries and your wages, and then you can kind of see how they increased year over year. Obviously, you would expect them to increase year over year. You have contracts in place. Employee benefits, they increased year over year. You would expect that as well, not only due to increases in your wages, but also the increase in the PESERS rate And then as you come down below, we'll kind of talk about this a lot too. Your purchase services and some of your other expenditures, supplies that you normally see increases in didn't increase as much related to the COVID-19 pandemic. The thing I really like about management's discussion and analysis is the fact that there's a section, factors bearing on the district's future. Unfortunately, an audit is a historical document, and when it's actually presented, we're actually so far ahead in the year. I mean, you're probably already working on your 20 or your 21-22 budget already at this point in time. So this kind of gives management an opportunity to talk about what's going to impact the school district going into the upcoming year. So that's the end of management's discussion analysis. Now I'm going to go towards the back of the audit report, because I'm going to go to what I think is the most important schedule of the audit report. And this is your budget to actual schedule in the back for your general fund. So this is kind of, okay, where were we when we went through the budget process in December of 2000, whatever, when we started the process. And
Carl, just for anybody who's trying to follow along, it's page 50.
Oh, page 50, sorry, yep. There.
Thank you, Michelle.
Oh. So in no more case than this year alone, I mean, you can never imagine when you went through the budget process that you would have went through what you went through and how you ended up for the year end. But that's just on a normal year as well, because things change during the year, and just this year was more than usual. So as you can see up at the top, your budget revenues were budgeted at $99.8 million. They actually came in at slightly higher. If you look at this is actually not bad. I mean, the COVID-19 impacted revenues the most. And the good news is the Radnor School Board has historically been really conservative budgeting your local source revenues. So even though you may have had multiple years where you had really good real estate transfer taxes, collections on your delinquent taxes, investment earnings were going through the roof, the board has always taken the stance of being conservative, and that was really good related to 1920 because investment earnings went in the tank, delinquent taxes weren't being collected towards the end of the year by the Tax Claim Bureau. So in reality, having that little bit of a surplus compared to what was budgeted is really, really, good. Because I've seen some of my districts that I work with have a negative number there, a sizable negative number there, just because they take a different budgeting philosophy related to local sources. As we come down, this is what Michelle was talking about before, and Susan was talking about. So as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, there were various grants that were available to the school districts. Number one, through the Pennsylvania Department of Education, through the Pennsylvania Department of Crime and Delinquency. And then right at the last second, the IU had received the Delaware County IU received a grant through the county that could be used for expenditures related to March through June. So most of this positive variance on a small budgeted number is related to those COVID-19 pandemic expenses. So those expenses were spent within that time period between March and June. And since they are cost reimbursement grants, the revenue was recognized at the same time, resulting in that positive variance there. So the offsetting expense is in the numbers down here, down below. So overall, your revenues were about $450,000 more than budget, which is good on the positive side, given the situation. So as we come down below, here's where we're going to see some of the larger variances. And if you look at other school districts and all our clients that we work with, everybody is the same. Everybody has pretty much, for the most part, a large under spending of their expenditures. And in the case of Radnor, when you look at it, number one, there were some vacancies that were unfilled at the time of the pandemic that continue to be unfilled through to the end of the year. You also got to think about there weren't health insurance costs related to people not being able to go to medical facilities. Your buildings were closed, et cetera. So all of that all combined together resulted in, this $2.9 million being under budget related to the 99.5 that was budgeted. But if you think about it too, if you look at that $2.9 million and you compare it to $100 million, that's actually not that bad. I know that a lot of this stuff is within your control related to salaries, but there's a lot of things related to the pandemic, especially related to the unfilled vacancies. And these functions up here, those are the big ticket items in terms of salaries. With unfilled vacancies created those positive variances. In addition, I think Michelle management pointed out in management's discussion analysis, you have this positive variance in the special programs. You have special ed programs, they were shut down. You have contracted services that the services weren't being provided, resulting in a positive variance. As we come down below, you have your revenues, you have your expenditures, and then you have this thing called other financing sources, uses, related to items that aren't necessarily related to operations. Primarily, these are the biggest budgeted items are related to transfers out, which are typically transfers out to not only your capital projects fund, but also to your debt sinking fund, which houses your QSKIB bonds or the escrow accounts for your QSKIB bonds. And then also, which most school districts do, they put a contingency or budgetary reserve. But because of the COVID-19 pandemic, you did not have to dip into that reserve because of the underspending in the line items up above. So at the beginning of the year, you had kind of budgeted to use $1.1 million. Nothing happened that you expected it to happen. You added $3 million. So that's a positive variance of $4 million. And then we'll kind of look at this and these transfers and how they go across the other funds here in a second. So at the beginning of the year, you had about $21.7 million, and you add the $3 million, you're at about 24.6 at the end of the year. So any questions, concerns? I know Michelle's been keeping everybody up to date on this, so no surprises. And any kind of changes that you might have seen from month to month.
So Carl, if you could help walk people through. So we did the transfer out is the negative 785.
Correct.
So, and it clearly impacted the excess, our excess of revenue over expenditures. And you've netted that out of our net change in fund balance. So where is that 785? I think that's maybe when you go to the fund balance, the various.
Yes, well, I can show you that right away. So
yeah.
Page, is that good?
Pardon?
And I'm going to go up. I don't know the exact page, but I'm going to go to page.
I think it's 19, Carl.
Thank you.
Yep,
That's
you
where
page
this stuff can get tricky is where did the money go?
So under this basis of accounting, so governmental accounting, it's kind of convoluted, et cetera. So everything is like on the fund basis. So it's like each fund is its own little entity with its own assets, its own liability, its own revenues, its own expenditures. So during periods of time, there's transfers between these funds. So here's that general fund that we were just talking about. And then
that's Fund 10. That's what our budget is based on.
Yeah. But here's that 785 that we were talking about right down here, right?
Yep.
So that 785, 479,000 was moved over to the capital projects fund. And that was a budgeted transfer.
Yep.
And then here in the debt sinking fund, so way back in 2008, 2009, during the last financial crisis, what happened is the government put out these non-interest bearing loans. So Radnor School District took advantage of that, of those loans, and went ahead and borrowed those funds. So what happens is they're not like your normal bonds. So when you're with your normal bonds, what happens is you pay your principal in, and the principal reduces on the bonds automatically. Where with these bonds that came out in 2008, 2009, related to the stimulus that was back in 2008, 2009, it accumulates in a Wells Fargo account. So this $2.7 million is a separate Wells Fargo account. And after 20 years, I think it's going to be coming up here after 2029 or something like that, 27, 29, those amounts will accumulate. So you budget the payment, it comes over here, And then when the bonds mature, which are, I think, in the 2027, 2029, this money will leave right here and it will go and it will satisfy those bonds as they mature. Does that make sense? So your other bonds, you don't have a sinking fund, but these bonds were specially set up and they're set up as an escrow and that escrow. So
Kind of like, Carl, can I just interrupt? I'm sorry.
Yep.
I'd like to try to, I never know who's watching us these days.
Yep.
It's just almost like we're saving up for our big balloon payment at the end.
that is correct.
People who have a
That's a
balloon
good way to put
payment
it.
mortgage.
Yeah.
This is like, we're going ahead and putting this money into our debt sinking fund. So when our balloon payment is due in 2027 or whenever it was, probably 20 years after the
Yep.
2007 crisis, we will have the money set aside that we needed to. And if you guys just look up ahead, because we never really talk about the debt sinking fund. Whenever we talk about budgets as a board and we do all of our, we do all of our budgeting, this is the only time of year we ever really talk about our debt sinking fund, right, Michelle? Right, Michelle? It's a once a year conversation, and I don't even know that it has a fund. I don't even think it has a fund number because it's money we owe. So we don't even talk about it in terms of it being part of our overall fund balance. Carl, just so you know, a lot of times we talk about our capital funds project. That's a fund. That's Fund 32 on page 19. Of course, general fund is Fund 10. We don't talk about the debt sinking fund because that's money we owe out. We don't. It's already spent.
It is legally restricted, so you couldn't even touch that money if you wanted to touch that money. So it was just set up that way, and but you have to account for it because those Wells Fargo accounts are in the name of the district and they need to be accounted for. So
Michelle, in our local sources at the top of this page on 19, where we took in, 83 million and change for general fund, 173 for capital fund, and the debt sinking 299, 561. How did you determine that dollar amount? Is that an amortized number that was calculated when this bond was issued, this QSIP?
I could answer that question. So
thank you.
All that money. So when this 281 comes over, it's invested in U.S. Treasury strips. So these Treasury strips. So this is the change in the fair market value of those U.S. Treasury strips. So you're putting money over, and they've determined that these U.S. Treasury strips are gonna, earn X amount of money, so that when the bonds do come due, that there's sufficient money to be there to satisfy the interest and so forth.
So the local source of 299 at the top is really just the investment
income. That's correct.
The investment income, and the transfer in is obviously an allocation from our general fund to make sure we have enough money there when the bond is due.
Yep, and that's a legally required transfer over. So they tell you how much and there's a footnote in the back that there's two of the bonds,
right?
That tells you how much for each bond comes over every year.
Right, and the non-major governmental fund, that's our community swim, right, Michelle? Carl, I don't even know that you would know that, but the fourth.
It's the community swim. Oh, I know.
Yep. Okay, great. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just trying to fill in blanks here.
Yep. So and there's the 25,000. So every year there's an annual appropriation that comes over as well to the community swim, because obviously the expenses are offsetting the local, especially with the COVID. It came over, so to kind of offset and keep the operations. All right, now I'm going to sneak up to page 17. And this kind of brings it all together, what we just talked about. We kind of just talked about the ins and the outs of the different funds. But as of a point in time, as of June 30th, 2020, there were certain assets. There's certain liabilities, in the excess of those assets over the liabilities is that fund balance we just talked about. So in the case of the general fund, there's $38.8 million of fund balance, or of assets, I should say. Most of that is related to cash that's on hand. We have some investments. There's some amounts that are due from the state on an annual basis just because of the timing. And then you have some liabilities. These aren't to be, these are your current liabilities. So these are amounts that are due within the next 2 months. So your biggest liability for the district at year end is your accrued salaries and benefits. So as you can see, that's $10 million. So what happens is the teachers, they're paid from September to June, or they work from September to June, and they earn their pay from September to June, providing the services, but you pay them over a 12-month period. So we need to accrue what they're owed and they're paid in July and August because they already provided you the service. So this is the teacher's summer pay for services they already provided from September to June of the previous year. So when we take the excess, you got your assets, your liabilities, and the excess of the two is that fund balance we just talked about on the previous page, or the $24.7 million. And then that $24.7 million, you need to have that amount needs to be, this unassigned amount needs to be 8% of your, cannot exceed 8% of your next year's general fund expenditure budget. So in the case of the district, there were additional amounts committed for the capital projects. Now, when you do a commitment, just for the new board members, commitments could only be for one-time non-recurring expenditures. So capital projects obviously meet that definition. So that amount was bumped up in accordance with your 5-year capital plan. Curriculum and technology initiatives. So you have those separate funds or those separate monies set aside that an appropriation is made on an annual basis to funds. Is that 17 and 19, Michelle?
15 and 17.
15
15
and
is
17.
technology.
Yeah.
17 is curriculum.
So what happened here is you made appropriations over from the into this commitment, but they didn't get spended once again just due to the COVID-19 and the expending of those funds. And also some of the technology that you did spend at the end of the year was actually met the criteria for some of those COVID grants. So those funds were used to kind of expend those instead of using these amounts. So those amounts are committed there based upon, annual appropriation. Then you also have an employer retirement rate stabilization fund. This is a separate account that's put aside to kind of offset the increases in PSERs. So for the current year, those amounts didn't need to be used just because of the savings that were within the other functions. And then also you have made commitments for your long time, you have some early retirement incentive plans and compensated absences within, those are one-time payments that are due to district employees. So when you remove all those commitments out of the 24.7 million, the unassigned amount is within the 8%. And like we talked about, Susan, there's the restricted amount. So the capital projects fund has not only bond proceeds, but transfers from the general fund. And those are restricted by law for capital projects. And there's the debt service restricted by law by the bond service, the bond indenture for the Q-skip bonds.
And
Right.
that's one of the reasons why when we talk about reallocating the fund balance, we like to leave it in the general fund under committed to capital projects, because if we would transfer it over into the capital projects fund, it then becomes restricted. So it gives us much more flexibility if we leave it in Fund 10 committed to capital projects than to move it over.
Yeah, and now, so people were moving money back and forth, and now when there's an annual financial report, so if you move the money over to capital reserve, it's restricted and you can't move it back. So if you even try to move it back, so there's a state report that's done. So if you move it over, and you try to move it back, the state won't let you. You get an error, it says you can't do this. So they got smart, so they kept it there. So
all right, if I jump in with a question here, Mr.
Yep, go ahead.
So on this page, and this may also be a question for Ms. Deco, Mr. Hogan, you talked about how there were certain expenditures we didn't necessarily have to make out of the curriculum fund, perhaps. We had some unexpected or accelerated expenditures out of technology. Isn't it also the case, though, that we, as our district philosophy, have tended to pay into these funds on an annual basis, because things like technology or things like a new curriculum program aren't expenditures you necessarily make every year. You might buy a new math curriculum once every 5 years. You might, upgrade your technology once every 3 years, something like that. Does this still reflect that that's been our district philosophy, and so the amounts that we've been committing to these funds is consistent with that past practice?
It does, Bradley. So one of the things that we do when we look at the transfer, and I'm just getting ready to do that with Dr. Hand for the technology, is that we look at a multiple year budget projection. Dr. Hand has a budget projection for much greater than the 5 years that we had looked at in the past. He and I are going to meet on Thursday to go over that. And then we'll adjust that transfer. But the transfer has been pretty consistent to the technology fund, to the curriculum fund, and also to community swim over the last several years. It was reduced for curriculum last year because we had parents contributing more towards the cost for the Surface Pros up at the high school. So we did reduce it last year by $270,000, but we're going to
technology or curriculum, Michelle? I'm sorry to interrupt.
It was technology.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Right, that was from the family contribution for the device the student uses all 4 years of high school.
That's correct.
Okay, and I think this was clear, but that capital projects fund, that's still within Fund 10. That's not what we've moved over to Fund 32, which I guess is just interesting. Is it seems we have a substantial amount committed to capital projects still in Fund 10. It seems significant compared to the amount that we've allocated with that one-way ticket to Fund 32.
So I think that's actually a fair statement. It's been the district's practice when there are additional funds that can't be set aside into the unassigned or these other committed accounts, that the money gets put into that capital projects. If you look at the 5-year capital plan, which didn't get presented last year, just because of timing with Mr. Brooks leaving and Mr. Dolan starting, there are much more than that $8.5 million and the $4.8 million worth of capital projects that the district anticipates needs to be done. And if you've been on
go ahead, Ms. Digo, didn't mean to interrupt you.
And if you've been on the facilities committee's been working with Steve Brennan's regarding a capital plan right now. And Sarah, you'll probably remember this better than me. When we looked at that plan, I think that there were over $20 million worth of anticipated projects over the next several years. So.
Yeah, and I'm sorry I jumped in. What I was curious about, that's not taking into account the new infrastructure project for accessibility and wellness. Those are other capital needs that we have in our facilities.
That's correct. There is some money that had been set aside for the replacement of the bleachers, and we've been using that to pay for the architect to help us do the design, but it does not include any of the soft costs or the cost to do the infrastructure project.
And wasn't that bleacher set aside in the hundreds of thousands, not in the millions?
It was a little over $1 million. I'd have to go back and look, Bradley. I think it was $1.2 million, and it had been set aside over three or four fiscal years to replace the bleachers. But when we started to look at the bleachers, we realized that wasn't a feasible project, and it didn't address the accessibility issues that we were experiencing on the campus.
And just while we're on this topic, I know we can get back to some other pages. Does this, from an auditor's perspective, is that capital need something that is taken into account here, or is this more of an analysis of looking at our year-to-year trends of revenues in and expenses out?
Greg, repeat the question one more time.
I'll make it less of a yes or no. So how does the auditor's perspective take into account that capital, that need for capital expenditures that's anticipated over the next several years? That's, potentially, closer to $20 million.
No, I mean, when I do look at it, we do take into account, I mean, obviously we read all the board minutes, we read the facility minutes, et cetera. We kind of see what needs to be done. And, I guess I would say something to the board if I saw something, if this was, a number in capital projects and there wasn't a need for capital projects to that extent. But we work with like 30 districts, and I don't know any school districts that don't have a capital need. And I think it's it's a luxury to have the ability to pay for these projects. So there's some schools that would have to go out and have to borrow money for like a $1 million project. So having the ability to fund those projects without having to go out and incur any type of additional debt is, I would think is good. I mean, obviously, if you're going to build a building, you're going to take out debt, et cetera. But for those projects, that don't necessarily require to take out debt. Having that ability to pay for those projects without taking out debt, I think is a good situation to be in.
All right. Yeah, that's appreciated. Sorry, my question was phrased inartfully at
So
first.
Bradley, really to answer your question, this is just a snapshot. This page 17 is a snapshot of what transpired in the 1920 fiscal year, and it doesn't take into account any of those additional anticipated capital budgeted items that we might show on that capital plan when we present it.
Are those accounted for elsewhere in the liabilities or not necessarily?
They are not accounted for anywhere.
Okay, that's what I thought. I just wanted, thanks for that clarification. That's all I had for this page. Thanks for letting me jump in.
Carl, I do want to jump in with two questions. And
Yep.
Bradley, to answer your question, one of the reasons is that whereas we're legally obligated to account for the for instance, the accrued salaries and payroll, at the end of the day, we're not legally we do have a responsibility to take care of the buildings, don't get me wrong. But at the end of the day, we could continue to defer that. So there's not a defined period of time where you would pinpoint and say, yes, we are obliged to spend X number of dollars. Is that accurate, Carl, the way I just said it?
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's going to be a good segue into the governmental activity stuff we go over.
Right. I do want to ask you a question. If you can scroll up on this page just a little bit.
Yeah.
So general fund, we're at the top where it says general fund, major funds, general fund is fund 10. The
Yep.
capital project fund there, that is fund 32.
That is correct.
Right. And then debt sinking is the other fund. So if you scroll down for just a minute, as opposed to, see where it says committed for or restricted for capital projects. Oh, there you go. That's the restricted. Thank you. And then
Yeah.
committed is over to the left. So Bradley, I just wanted to be sure that when you were talking about, committed and restricted are two, it's kind of like the difference between early decision and early action. One is more restrictive. So the fund 32 capital projects is a restricted fund, and then that capital projects committed is still within fund 10. So I wasn't sure when you were asking about the projects fund, Bradley, I wasn't sure which one of those funds you were talking about, the one within fund 10 or fund 32.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. And indeed, what I was observing is that it appeared to me that what we had committed to capital projects, but that remained in Fund 10, just looked like a larger amount to what had been already restricted in Fund 32 for capital projects.
Interestingly, Fund 32, so Michelle, we must have been spending some of the infrastructure project. Our total has gone down from 5.3 to 4.8. So we are in fact spending some of that money this year as we've made commitments to your point, to Breslin Architects and the various, as the board has taken action and committed ourselves in moving forward on that project. Fund 32, the total has gone down by about looks like almost just shy of $500,000. If I look at 2019 to 2020, over on the right-hand side, is that accurate? Or Carl, maybe you can answer better than I.
There were expenditures out of the capital reserve fund.
That's what I'm saying. Exactly. That's exactly my point. Yep.
Which are, okay.
And not to belabor the point, but just the one point Bradley was making. We have more flexibility if the capital funds is larger in the general fund, Fund 10, than it is in 32. So I don't know that it's
right.
I don't know that it needs to be suggestive that one should be larger than another. Actually, it kind of makes sense to me that the one in Fund 10 may be the larger one just because it provides us greater flexibility as a school district.
Yep.
Agreed. And moreover, just it was very helpful to hear, even though it's not required to be accounted for as a liability here, even looking at those two different funds in the aggregate, what's restricted for capital projects in Fund 32 and what's committed to capital projects in Fund 10 is still less than what we at least anticipate as capital needs coming down the pike. So that's helpful to know, even if it's not part of what's described as a liability here.
So I think the key thing is for the board is these committed numbers, they could be moved around based upon your need just by a board resolution. So
Right, exactly. Okay, so you wanted to move on, or Nancy, I
Yep.
don't know if you had any questions or if we're all filling in the blanks. Good, all righty.
All right, I just want everybody to, I mean, before I get, we're gonna talk about the governmental activities. I know Susan, I'm gonna go over one more statement, but I want everybody to picture this in the statement we just went over. So what we just went over is your current status, like you have your fund balance, and on an annual basis, you do a budget, and you figure out on your budget basis, what revenues do we need to meet your current year expenditures that you do on an annual basis? And are we going to use any of this existing fund balance to subsidize those revenues? So that's what you do on an annual basis. Everything's predicated on current assets over current liabilities. And when we go to another statement, after one more statement I'm going to show you, you're going to kind of look at the school district on a long-term basis. What are the liabilities of the school district that are due not only right after year end, but also into the future. But before I do that, I just want to touch base. You have two other funds that I definitely want to point out. You have a food service fund. During the year, you had to continue to pay your food service employees, even though you had to shut down. There was a loss in your food service fund for the current year, but because the food service fund, ignore the deficit down below, but because the food service fund had liquidity at year end, you were able to fund that current year loss, just because of the fact that the district had a strong financial position related to its food service, notwithstanding this down below, and I'll explain that negative amount in a second. But also you have an internal service fund, and the internal service fund tracks the activity in your Delaware County Healthcare Consortium. So as you can see, that fund had an increase, a pretty sizable increase, just because of the fact that of the shutdown. So I would imagine when we see this number next year and people started going back and getting their medical procedures done and all that kind of whatnot, that this amount of reserve within the Delaware County Healthcare Consortium will decrease. And I think the Delaware County Healthcare Consortium is looking for about 6 months of claims down here, or 6 months of claims down below. So annually, you might be a little bit higher. You're right on board.
Carl, can you go up for a second?
Yep.
I could swear I missed, there's numbers on your page. What page are you on right there?
I'm on page 22.
Oh, okay, thank you. I was looking at page 21 and I wasn't
Alright.
seeing the 10 million at the top of the page. Thank you.
Okay. Yep.
So basically, because we basically self-pay the insurance as part of the consortium, and people didn't, I mean, while there may have been many people who were sick this year, they didn't use their healthcare dollars the way they typically would.
Yep.
And
So-
and so it's the fund has grown. Our employees have paid into the fund as part of their health, paying for their health care. They haven't necessarily utilized all of their health care that they would have. And we'll probably see a big swing. We may very well see a big swing the other way in the next year or two, depending on what people were typically using those healthcare
Correct.
dollars for.
Yep.
Okay.
And
I had
then
a
what
question
happens on
about,
an annual basis.
sorry, Carl, I had a question about the food service fund before we move too much
Yeah.
further. You said this year we had enough money left over in the fund to cover the deficit,
Yeah.
the shortfall. But obviously with hybrid, and COVID closures, our revenues are going to be down significantly. Well, maybe not. I assume they would be down significantly again this year. And maybe this isn't fair to ask you, maybe Michelle needs to answer, but do we anticipate being able to cover losses again this year with what's in that fund? Or do we expect that the 2020-21 school year, that's going to be, a net loss? I know I assume it'll be a loss, but I mean, we're paying staff. I don't think we're necessarily paying significantly less staff.
So we're actually paying the same amount of staff as we paid last year. I
Right.
anticipate that we will probably see a loss again. Remember that the changes with food service now made food available to anyone residing in Radnor Township under the age of 18 for free. So regardless of if they're in school or not school, when you think about the fact that the food service department typically sold about $500,000 worth of a la carte pizza every year. The loss of that additional a la carte revenue is really where the food service department makes its biggest profit. So Sarah, I anticipate that we will have a loss again next year. I do believe that we'll be able to cover it. It's one of the things that we've been very lucky to have a surplus in our food service department. PDE doesn't necessarily like you to have a large surplus in your food service department because as a proprietary fund, it's supposed to kind of be a break even.
Yep.
And that's actually hurt us when it comes to applying for grants because we have a surplus. We were not allowed to apply for several equipment grants that we would have liked to have applied for in the food service area.
So when you say that we have to make food available for free, we're making a la carte pizza available for free too, or it's just the National School Lunch Program food?
It's the National School Lunch Program. So it is, all meals are packaged as a meal component so that we can submit it for reimbursement through the National School Lunch Program.
Okay, so we aren't selling a la carte food this year.
We have not started to. We have been talking about the possibility of offering some limited a la carte menu items. We've had some student requests for some things like Gatorades and things like that. So we have talked about how we can do that safely. We anticipate that we may be able to start that sometime after the start of the year.
So Sarah, if you look here, I'm looking at the balance sheet now. So going into this year, there was $900,000, there. So like Michelle said, you've had this surplus that the state doesn't necessarily, look nicely upon. But in this case, I literally just got it off of Zoom from another school district, and they had to move $200,000 from their general fund to the food service to make up their $200,000. So just the fact that you had this surplus there, I had the liquidity at year end is great. So
okay.
Now then 943, you had some accounts payable, and as you can see here, this unearned revenue. So all of a sudden, all these kids have all these amounts on hand for lunch, and then schools just get shut down. They never spend it. So that's why you see the increase in the unearned revenue year over year.
Okay. Thank you. That's helpful too.
And
So Carl, I'm trying to follow real quick on this one because I've never seen food service lose money. So I'm trying to match the, we had basically the assets of 1.1 million.
Mm-hmm.
And charges for services. On top of that, we still took in 1.034 million. Now I'm at the top of page 22, but we had the expenses of 1.6 million, 1.6 basically. So the 655 loss is offset somewhat by the federal, state,
Mm-hmm. The National School Lunch Program.
Yeah, by those the non-operating sources. So that's fine. So then we had a net loss of 217. How did you get to the 223 and the 440? The net position at the end of the year.
So that's what I was trying to, this is where we're going down the rabbit hole like you're talking about, because the food service fund is accounted for like a business. So there's actuarial. So those PSERS liabilities are on your books for the food service. So they're driving, so even though your food service fund is making a profit, like cash in and cash out, you have these huge liabilities sitting on your books related to its proportionate share of the PSERS liability. So PSERS liability, and we're putting a piece of that on the food service fund. And we could talk about that with the business type activities.
No, it's funny. I don't want to go too long here, but Michelle, at some point during the budget season, we should talk about it because it was my understanding we were actually utilizing some other employees to help with the food service department. And this conversation is making me wonder, well, is that cost getting credited to the food service department or to the department in which they typically work? We don't have to get into that now, but it was kind of raising that. It is a bit of an accounting nightmare. Thank you for being here, Carl. All right, so internal service fund, we understand that. Was there more about this page you wanted to tell us?
Nope, and then I'm just gonna go over just that last page that you want me to go over. So,
oh yeah, thank you.
So about 20 years ago, they wanted to make these financial statements more difficult than they already are. So everything's great. Bradner has a nice fund balance, assets over liabilities. But actually, if the school district was actually operating like a business, it wouldn't look as much of a rosy picture. So a couple of years ago, or 20 years
Page
ago,
are you on, Carl? Which page is that?
I'm on page number 15.
Thanks.
Yep. So they wanted to put an element in these financial statements like, hey, what if the school district operated like a business? And you put it's not only its current assets and its current liabilities, but it also its non-current assets and non-current liabilities. So this is separated into governmental activities and business type activities. Business type activities is just your food service fund. By definition, food service fund operates like a business. Everything else is mishmashed into governmental activities. So that general fund, the capital projects fund, the debt service sinking fund, the internal service fund is all in this governmental activities, one big district, operation. So not only are those current assets that we just talked about, there's also non-current assets, which are your capital assets. And those capital assets in these financial statements are being depreciated like a business. And then down below, we have non-current liabilities. And in your non-current liabilities, we have like your bonds payable. There's a footnote that shows what this is all made up of, and we'll go over in a second. But you have your bonds payable, your actuarial liabilities, your compensated absences. And what's driving this number here that's doing more than 1 year is that net pension liability. So about 6 years ago, every school district in the state needed to put their proportionate share of the PSERS liability. So PSERS has assets and they have a liability that they determined that is based upon not only existing retirees, but existing employees and what that cost would be to the district. So we'll kind of go over that in a second, what that number is for the district. But that being said, if you operated like a business and you had these long-term liabilities, you don't have a positive fund balance, you actually have a negative net position, which is being driven by these actuarial liabilities. So one could say that all these school districts have all this money, which they do on a short term, but the long-term perspective of one looking at these financial statements would see that there's a big long-term burden on these school districts, not only for, bonds, but also for these pension liabilities, OPEB liabilities, compensated absences, et cetera. So it kind of puts things in perspective. So when one says you have all this money, there is a burden that needs to be paid for in the future.
Remember the first year that I've been on the board, this is going to be my 8th year. The first year that this liability showed up on the balance sheet.
Yeah.
I will never forget, like it came, we were like, what the heck is this? Because it was just a drastic change from one year to the next. It makes sense when you think about it, but it was a shock to the government.
Now what the messed up thing is, so the state pays for half of your retirement, but the state doesn't put half of the liability on their books because they
don't want to carry it.
Well, technically they don't have to pay that 50%. It's an annual appropriation. Now, obviously there'd be a mass mutiny if they didn't pay it, but they don't have it on their books, but the school districts have it. So I just want to show everybody what makes up this 238 million real quick. I know you guys have other stuff that we're all hour in, but here's that $238 million. There is right there. So it kind of goes over 2 pages. Here's your bonds, your notes payable. There's those QSCIB bonds we were just talking about, $5 million that's getting put away. And here's the big numbers down here. So in the case of Radnor School District, it actually decreased in the current year because your contributions are increasing, market conditions are good. But in the case of Radnor, it's 143 plus the 1.5, so it's about $145 million that's how much underwater PSERS is at this point in time. And it kind of puts in perspective, why is my PSERS rate increasing exponentially and I'm paying 33 cents or even more than 33 cents on every dollar? And that's it right there if you kind of look at it. So
great. Do you guys have any more? Do you have any more questions? I mean, we could keep talking about this. I want to end on one happy note.
Yeah.
Page 13. We have a pretty nice bond rating from Moody's on our, which is a good piece of information for us to just be aware of, given that we're talking about at some point in 2021, we'll be talking about, going out for bonds.
Yeah, so that was actually one of the questions I had was, does our yes, we show a net position of a deficit, but it's it's $4 million smaller than it was the year before. Does that improve our position in terms of getting bonds?
The funny thing is, so when this whole thing came out and you had to put this net pension liability in your books, intuitively you're thinking, oh my God, this is going to kill everybody's bond rating. They could care less about it. All they care about is what's your fund balance and are you raising taxes? They might as well just condense it down to those two questions when you go to a bond rating call. So
I think we had bond counsel. I remember this was our for Mrs. Monahan and myself and the other board members who've been on for a year. I think this was our first regular business meeting in December 2019. We had bond counsel there, and I remember that's exactly what they said. We talked about that liability, and they said as long as you're not using fund balance on a year-to-year basis to pay off your annual liabilities, as long as you're not dipping into fund balance to pay operating expenses, they felt good. And I think Radnor had been at an AA2 sometime in the last 10 years and has kind of climbed back up to an AA1, which I agree with Mrs. Stern. That's very encouraging that we're able to be in that position.
Yeah, it's a clean. And then the other thing I just want to say, it's an unqualified. It's a clean audit. That's the MD&A is that it's a clean audit, correct?
yeah, and also I just want to point out too, we talked about all the numbers and we talked about clean audit report, but there's no findings in your audit report. The federal award programs that we examine, the school district has had them for a long time. The state examines them on an annual basis in addition to us through their federal monitoring program. The district has all the internal controls in place. The business staff is staffed as such that those segregation of duties are put in place. And, it's, not everybody has that. Most of the school districts in Delaware County have that luxury, but not everybody does to have the skill sets that Radnor does to be able to, not have the findings, et cetera. So.
Right. Okay. So, Nancy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a general quick question. I saw on page 42 and 46, there is an asset class allocation that the board had approved back in June of 2019. How often is that reviewed or, changed up?
Oh, so these are boilerplate notes provided to us by the by PSERS. So this is on a 1-year lag. These footnotes will probably change. So PSERS did make changes to the funding policies. So when you see the next year audit report, this is not controlled by the board in any way, shape, or form. So you're talking 42?
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I think it's we're talking about two different things. It was on if you look at the top of page 46.
46.
Actually, like halfway down the bottom, right there.
Okay.
Yeah. See how I just raised the question because I know it's something that the board had reviewed and approved. And this may be a question for Michelle. How often do we relook at these? How we, what assets are invested in or allocated with? Because it's a big, the liability is pretty big.
Nancy, I think they're saying it's the PSERS board.
It's the PSERS board, Nancy.
It's not our board.
It's not
Okay.
ours.
I was
Yeah,
like,
you have no control.
having to do, look
No,
at.
we never had to do that.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
we're not in charge of how the money gets, even our own investments. Michelle, I'm assuming it's our investment guys who manage our funds and decide how to do the asset allocation.
okay. All
We
right.
actually work with different investment groups to help us manage our funds and invest in the appropriate things. As a government entity, we're restricted on what we can invest in. So we can't invest in risky type of investments. So we work with Pliget, we work with PASLAF, we work with a variety of different groups, and of course, TD Bank, our local bank branch.
I miss the Peasers board. That's what happens when you get to page 40.
Hey, you read it. That's good.
All right. So Carl, I have to thank you. I think this has been really, really, and really laying a nice groundwork for the finance committee to understand, the kind of the basics of what we, what this year has meant and what our numbers mean. And this is, and I do want to thank Ms. Deco again, yet again, another clean audit report. I really appreciate your good work there. And that I've always lived in the world of, hey, if we land our year in the 2% range, 2 or so percent, a 98 on budgeting is pretty darn good. In COVID, for us to be more like, okay, maybe we got a 96 instead, we're off 3 to 4 million. That's tremendous. And I'm just very grateful for you, for your budgeting approach has been to the benefit of Radnor. So thank you.
Thank you. I also want to just thank Penny Tansey, my assistant, and all the other business office staff. Without all of their input and their expert level of expertise, a clean audit report would be much more difficult. So
sure.
Thank you to them.
Well, and the other thing is, unfortunately, I think if we were to look at year-to-date budgets, we'd see a lot of that, what we saved last year. I think we're going to find we're spending in some significant areas in this 2021 school year, particularly, trying to make sure our buildings are staffed. So it feels like it, at least, Mr. Batchelor. Is that accurate?
Yeah, well, the end of the year will tell, but yes, I think
Yes.
and Michelle and the team have all been talking about that, and we've actually talked about that actually at this committee. Some of the expenses we're looking at this year, both staffing related and just the things that we've had to buy that obviously weren't anticipated with COVID and all the different preventative measures we've taken. But no, and I just want to echo what Susan just shared too, that thank you, Michelle. It is we kind of just gloss over. We're used to clean audits, but so we go through it quickly. But thank you, Michelle and team, for all the hard work to have that. And Carl, thank you for the time that you spend with us each year. It's very much appreciated.
Yeah,
All
I
righty.
don't think anybody, the amount of time we actually go over the audit doesn't put into effect of, it takes weeks to put this all together. So.
Well, I learned some new things tonight. I always feel like I learn a little bit more every year. So I really appreciated that. All right, we're going to move on to our next agenda item. And I'm going to thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's see. So we will see our audit on the board agenda on the 15th for approval. And, hopefully even other board members, if they can watch even just this portion of the meeting, I think that will be helpful. The next item is approval of the Radnor Township School District's contribution to Delaware County Community College for 21-22 school year. Ms. Deco, I don't know that I knew this was coming up, so maybe you have some background on this?
Real quick, just before we move on, sure. Do we want Carl back for the board meeting? I think we usually do.
Yeah, we talked about that. He said he thinks someone will be there in 2 weeks.
Okay, that's all. Just want to make sure.
And I'll follow up with him tomorrow, Ken.
Great.
Thank you.
So this actually came later, and I just want to make a notation. This really is not for board approval. This is really informational. We'll actually do board approval at a later date, and we'll have a roll call vote. And I think that's what you're remembering. Jackie was off last week, so that's my mistake. I'm going to take full credit for putting it on there as an agenda approval. And she did say to me, Michelle, that's not for board approval. So I make a terrible secretary. I'm just going to let you all know that. So it is informational. Those items, those amounts will be included in our 2021-2022 budget.
Correct. Thank you. So that's really, so this is informational. We usually approve this dollar amount. It feels like later in the school year. That was the reason I was surprised about this. So we'll change the agenda item for the board. Won't even be on the board agenda then, correct?
Correct. So what I'll have Jackie do is we'll actually make a correction, and then we can post that correction noted with the date that we changed it.
Right. And in the minutes, we can just reflect for this item that it was it was an update, we're not looking for board approval. So we are seeing a slight increase. It'll be interesting when we get the paperwork and and usually they send us supporting information. It'll be interesting to hear how they're moving along and how they're functioning in COVID. That will be, we'll get that at some point down the road. And then item 4.4 is renewal of our workers' compensation insurance. Michelle, do you have some background here?
So Todd's actually joining us. I'm gonna turn this over to him. When the agenda went out, we did not have the information. We did just recently get it. I don't know that Todd's even had an opportunity to review it. I have not had an opportunity to look at it in depth.
I've been reviewing
Welcome,
it
Todd.
over the weekend. Thank you. So our workers' comp claim did slightly go up. It's about a 5% increase for premiums from last year to this future year. The reason is we didn't have a drastic number of additional claims. However, the claims we had were typically more costly than previous years. We had some infections, we had some slip and falls on the ice and those type of things. So not what I wanted to see, a 5% increase, but I'm comfortable with that based on the losses that we've had.
We self-insure for workers' comp, correct?
Yeah, we go through Tompkins and we pay them a premium
Right, okay.
to handle it.
All right, does anybody have any questions? So Michelle, will you have specific information at the December 15th meeting? Or will you just be incorporating the numbers into the budget, but at some point you need us to actually approve the workman's compensation? Oh, wait a second, hold on. I'm just having a memory. We just switched carriers last year on workman's comp.
Correct. We saved a boatload of money by switching
remembering that.
carriers. Right. We saved a boatload of money by switching carriers. This isn't a drastic. It's not that you're raising it because we've been with them a year now, but it is a January 1 to January 1 policy. So that's why we will need a board vote to approve the contract for January 1 of 21.
Okay, so less about the rates and more about just approving the contract.
Correct.
All right, I don't know if other board members have questions. I do have one question if, I don't know if others have them first. Yes, Sarah, go ahead.
This is clearly coming from a corporate sector question. When you say the size of the claims has increased, are they specifically, you mentioned falling on the ice, are there specific safety issues that we should be addressing with staff?
Yeah, we have a safety committee. They actually have come out and looked at our buildings and walked through them and see what we do. They're very satisfied with what we have and what we do. And as far as removal of ice and snow, it's just things that typically happen. And one of them, like I said, was an infection. And when you get the infections and this has been for, I'm going to say 6 or 7 months. They're trying to fight this infection and they're trying to get it squared away. So there's always cost involved in that.
Okay. Just when I talk about safety, I'm thinking both sides of it, not just what we as a district are doing to keep the facility safe, but also reminding our employees that there's an obligation to be mindful. So if you're out walking and it's cold, you should be careful that there's ice. So, usually from a corporate standpoint, we look at it both ways. Like, what's your responsibility to try to keep yourself safe too? So just the slipping on the ice made me think of that. And maybe, the decrease in number of claims is a good sign and I shouldn't worry about it. Just asking.
Okay, thank you.
More like employer best practices and employee best practices.
Yeah.
Got it. Todd, I remember when we made this change to the new carrier, there were some, we were also hoping for an improvement in the customer representative experience. What's the feedback been on working with this new carrier from the employee perspective? Do we have feedback on that?
Yeah, Jess King, our benefits coordinator, handles it all, and she is very, very pleased. It's very responsive. Everything that they said they were going to do on the customer service end, they've done.
Okay, so even with this rate hike, are we still? And I hear what you're saying. It's incident specific. So we happen to have had a tough year, but even with the rate hike, are we still competitive with our old carrier?
We're still under. I think we saved, and Michelle, I'm gonna guess $70,000 or $80,000 when we switched. So we're still way ahead of the ball game with what we would have been paying.
Okay, all right, great. Nancy, Bradley, I don't know if you guys had any. As soon as I said workman's comp, I remembered. I remembered this was just last year. Yes, Bradley, go ahead.
Just one question. Is there anything in the workman's comp bucket that would arise out of COVID? Or are COVID type exposures, illnesses, incidences all handled through other leaves and medical insurance.
Everything else is through. No COVID-related issues have gone through workers' compensation.
And could they, or is that just the wrong category for anything?
It would basically be the wrong category. I actually talked to Mike Christofko back in spring about this, if it is, and he doesn't feel that any workers' comp carriers would even address the COVID, because you'd have to truly prove that it had happened in the district, and that would be very tough to do.
Yeah, I agreed. I think that would be very tough, especially what's going on now in the community. All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Stitzel. It's appreciated.
Oh, absolutely.
Great. Thank you, Todd, for that. Nancy, I don't know if you have any questions. You're good. All righty.
One more, Susan, real quick. Sorry. And
Sure,
I know
no
we're
worries.
live. I know Mr. Stitzel, Mrs. Stern reminded me of this. You mentioned that last year there were employees who still had to continue to deal with the prior workers' benefit company because they had outstanding claims, and that has any of that been resolved? Have they gotten kind of better treatment, or have there been problems even further since we left that contract?
There have not been any additional problems that I know of, and most of those claims have been finalized and closed with the previous carrier.
Great. Okay, thanks.
Great. All righty. Do we have any new business tonight? All righty. Do we have any public comment? Allison?
There is no public comment.
All righty. Well, with my apologies for running late, but I feel like we covered a lot of good information with the audit, which is probably one of our most important pieces of information and one of our important obligations. And hopefully that will make the board meeting conversation about that go smoothly. I'm going to adjourn the meeting. I will see you at the business meeting. Thank you, everyone. Good night.